I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize it in the street.
In the final months of her life, Audrey Hepburn was living in a farmhouse in the Swiss village of Tolakinaz that she had named La Paisible, the peaceful one. She had come home to die there after a terminal cancer diagnosis, and she was doing what she had always done with difficult things, absorbing them quietly, without visible collapse, and thinking about what remained unfinished. Those who were with her in those months spoke about her composure in terms that made it sound almost unsettling, because it was so complete. What she expressed most was not fear, but a kind of unresolved wondering about someone she had spent her entire life trying to understand. In conversations in those final months, she returned to one person with consistency that those who knew her well found striking. Not one of her two husbands. Not the co-star who had fallen completely in love with her and asked her to marry him. Someone most people, even devoted fans who thought they understood her story, would not immediately guess. The answer to who that person was does not just complete a detail in a famous life. It reframes the entire story of who Audrey Hepburn was and why she made the choices she made across 6 decades of loving, losing, and searching. She was born Audrey Kathleen Rustin in Brussels in 1929 to a Dutch baroness mother and a British father named Joseph Rustin. And her earliest years had the surface appearance of cosmopolitan privilege. The family moved regularly between London, Arnhem, and elsewhere, and by the time she was still quite young, she spoke 6 languages. What was happening beneath that surface was something considerably more complicated. Both of her parents had been open supporters of fascism in the 1930s, not quietly but actively, attending rallies and aligning themselves publicly with the ideology of the Nazi regime. Then, in 1935, her father made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He became so absorbed in far-right politics that he walked out on Audrey and her mother entirely and relocated to London. She was 6 years old. That abandonment became, by her own account repeated in interviews across the subsequent decades, the defining emotional wound of her life. She was sent to boarding school in Kent, where she watched other children go home during holidays and waited for a father who had visitation rights and never used them. He simply did not come. Then the war began, and she was sent to the Netherlands in the belief that it would be safer than England. It was not. German forces invaded in 1940, when she was 10 years old, and she found herself living under occupation, hiding in cellars while gunfire moved to the streets above, adopting a Dutch name to avoid being identified as English. In 1942, 2 of her uncles were arrested by the Nazis and executed. After that, she stopped trying simply to survive and began quietly contributing to survival, joining the Dutch resistance, carrying messages and underground newspapers, sometimes concealing them in her shoes. She also danced. Ballet had been her dream before the war. During it, she used the dream differently, performing at secret fundraisers for the resistance in rooms where no one could applaud because a single sound might give them away. By 1944, famine had swept through the Netherlands during one of the coldest winters on record. German blockades had cut off food supplies. Her family ate tulip bulbs. Her health deteriorated into malnutrition, anemia, and respiratory illness. The girl who would become one of the most photographed women of the 20th century was, in that season, a starving teenager trying to survive a war that should never have been her responsibility to survive. When liberation finally came, a UNICEF worker handed her a chocolate bar. She remembered it for the rest of her life. She remembered what it meant to be a child in crisis, and to have a stranger show up anyway. The psychological shape that her father's abandonment left on her has been examined by multiple biographers and by those who knew her closely, and the pattern they describe is consistent. The men she was drawn to tended to be older, authoritative, and in control. The first man she married, Mel Ferrer, fit that profile with precision. They met through Gregory Peck in the early 1950s and were cast together in the stage production Undine, where whatever existed between them offstage became impossible to ignore. By September 1954, they were married in a quiet ceremony in Switzerland. In the early years, the partnership genuinely worked. Ferrer took an active role in shaping her career, and Audrey, still establishing herself in Hollywood despite already having won an Academy Award, welcomed the structure and guidance. But there's a fine line between support and control, and over time that line disappeared entirely. People close to the couple began noticing the shift. Farrer had opinions about everything: which roles she should accept, how she should present herself publicly, who she should spend time with. What had begun as creative collaboration became something considerably more suffocating. Audrey was one of the most famous women in the world. Yet inside her marriage, she consistently deferred to a man whose own career was less successful than hers and who compensated for that asymmetry through control. And then there was the devastation of the miscarriages. She had two of them, the first in 1955 and the second in 1959, following a fall from a horse on the set of The Unforgiven that broke her back. Both losses were profound. She wanted children with an urgency that was not casual but central to how she understood the life she was building. When her son Sean was finally born in 1960, she stepped away from acting for a full year, something almost unheard of for someone at the peak of her professional fame, and devoted herself to motherhood without apparent ambivalence. The marriage kept eroding regardless. After 14 years, it ended. She walked away emotionally drained and, for the first time in years, free. Before Farrer, before the marriage, there had been William Holden. The connection happened on the set of Sabrina in 1954, in circumstances that were already uncomfortable before filming began, because Humphrey Bogart had wanted the role to go to his wife and did not hide his resentment toward the young actress who had received it instead. Holden responded to Audrey in the exact opposite direction. From their first interactions, he was drawn to her completely, and the chemistry between them was real in a way that everyone around them could observe. Their relationship deepened quickly beyond professional. He fell hard. He asked her to marry him. She said no. The reason was not complicated, and it was final. She wanted children, and Holden had undergone a vasectomy. That future she carried in her mind, with children at its center, could not accommodate that reality regardless of what she felt for him. He never entirely moved on from her. She walked away because she had learned, somewhere in the years of waiting for her father and surviving a war alone, that wanting something and trusting someone with your future were two entirely different calculations. The second marriage, to Italian psychiatrist Andrea Detti, began during a summer cruise in the Mediterranean in the late 1960s and had the quality of a deliberate reconstruction. She was choosing warmth and ease over the rigidity of her first marriage, choosing private life over the career she had already stepped away from, choosing Rome and domesticity and a slower pace over everything Hollywood was still willing to offer her. Diddy was charming, socially fluent, and apparently everything Farrer had not been. Within 6 months they were married. She moved to Rome. For a while, it looked like exactly the life she had described wanting. But Diddy had a version of himself he had kept concealed during those Mediterranean evenings. The affairs began early and did not stop, and they were not discreet. Reports of his extramarital relationships became a regular feature of the Italian press. She had left Hollywood specifically to escape public exposure and found herself living inside a different and more personal kind of spectacle. She stayed longer than most people expected, partly for their son Luca, born in 1970, and partly because she was not someone who gave up easily on commitments she had made. When the marriage finally ended, those close to her described the divorce as having left her more guarded than she had been before. After Diddy, she retreated to La Paisible in Switzerland and built a life that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew only her film persona. She turned down major roles. She avoided the social circuit. She spent time in her garden, walked her dogs, cooked, and lived quietly in a way that her neighbors in Tolkienaz later recalled simply as being a good neighbor, someone who said good morning at the market and did not need to be anything more than that. It was in this period that Robert Wolders entered her life. They met at a charity auction in the late 1970s. He was a Dutch actor and businessman who had recently lost his wife to illness. Their first exchange was quiet, unremarkable on the surface. He invited her somewhere shortly after. She declined. She had work. The following day, she reached out and suggested they meet for a drink. That drink became a conversation that lasted hours. The conversations became daily phone calls. What they built together was neither glamorous nor dramatic, which was precisely the point. Both had lived through enough loss and enough public exposure and enough relationships that had asked them to perform versions of themselves they could not sustain. They offered each other steadiness, respect, and the unhurried quality of genuine mutual recognition. They never married formally. She introduced him as her husband because the commitment was already complete in every way that mattered to her. In 1988, at a UNICEF concert she attended simply as a guest, she found herself speaking without a script about hunger and occupation and what it meant to be a child in wartime. A senior UNICEF official was in the audience. By the end of the evening, he had offered her a full ambassadorship. She accepted, and the years that followed took her to Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, and El Salvador, some of the most difficult environments on earth. She sat with children in conditions that mirrored what she had lived through in the Netherlands 50 years earlier. Those who accompanied her consistently noted that she did not treat the work as an obligation. She treated it as something unfinished, a debt she felt she owed to the version of herself that a stranger had once handed a chocolate bar to after liberation. Wolders traveled with her on many of these missions, present not as a manager of a celebrity schedule, but as someone who simply refused to let her do the hardest parts alone. In 1992, after returning from a humanitarian trip to Somalia, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Testing in Los Angeles revealed pseudomyxoma peritoneal, a rare and aggressive cancer originating in the appendix. Surgery was performed quickly, but the disease had already spread too far. The diagnosis was terminal. She requested to go home. She was too fragile to travel commercially. It was Hubert de Givenchy, her friend of nearly 40 years, the designer whose clothes had accompanied the most iconic chapters of her public life, who arranged a private jet and made the journey possible. She arrived home to La Paisable. She spent a final Christmas there, surrounded by the people who mattered most, and in a gesture that those present described as quietly characteristic of her, she gave specific and intentional gifts. Winter coats for the three men she was closest to, Wolders, her son Sean, and Givenchy. On January 20th, 1993, she died peacefully at home. So, who was the one man she named in those final months as the one she never truly got over? The answer surprises people because it does not fit the romantic framing that the question implies. It was not Holden, whose proposal she had declined with a kind of disciplined self-protection that revealed how much she guarded herself after being hurt. It was not Ferrer, who had diminished her across 14 years of marriage. It was not Diddy, whose betrayals had left her more guarded than she had been before. It was her father, Joseph Rustin, who had left when she was 6 and never come back in any way that counted. In her final years, those who were close to her in Switzerland observed that she returned to him in conversation with consistency that went beyond ordinary grief and into something more like an open question she had never been able to close. Not with bitterness. She was not built for sustained bitterness, but with a kind of wondering about what had been inside him, whether he had felt the absence the way she had, whether there had been something in him that simply could not find its way out. She had found him in the 1960s through the Red Cross. He had been living quietly in Dublin since 1939, the same year he had driven her to the airport and sent her away. She had approached that reunion carrying a hope that she understood, even as she carried it, might not be met. He greeted her with indifference. The reconciliation she had built in her imagination across decades simply did not happen. She forgave him anyway. She supported him financially for the rest of his life. He died without giving her the answer she had spent her life constructing the question for. Every major romantic decision she made, the older men, the authoritative figures, the willingness to stay in relationships well past the point they had stopped working, traces back to that original absence and emotional template it established before she was old enough to recognize what was being written. Even her UNICEF work, specifically its focus on children in crisis and children who had lost the structures they depended on, carried the shape of something deeply personal. She once said in one of her most quoted later interviews that the best thing you could leave your children was the feeling of being loved. It was a simple statement, but given everything she had lived through and everything she had spent her life trying to find, it was also something considerably more. It was the thing she had needed most and received least from the first person who was supposed to provide it. She spent the remainder of her life trying to give it to others. Robert Wolders, who knew her better than almost anyone in her final decade, said afterward that what struck him most about her was not her